The radio went dead at 2:47 in the morning. Not from a bullet. Not from a bomb. Not because the Taliban had found them. The team cut it themselves. For men, deep inside Helmand Province, in the kind of darkness that doesn't exist anywhere else on Earth. And they made a choice that every piece of their training told them never to make. They went silent. Back at base, the duty officer stared at the screen and felt his stomach drop. An SAS patrol in the heart of Taliban territory, no signal, no contact, no way to reach them. Protocol said they were already compromised. Protocol said you prepare for the worst. But protocol had never accounted for what these four men had just seen. Because what they had found in the dark, crouched in the dust less than 200 meters from a Taliban compound on the outskirts of Sangin, was not what they had been sent to find. It was something else entirely. Something that would explain why this war had lasted so much longer than anyone had promised. Something that certain very powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure no one ever discovered. And the moment they understood what they were looking at, they made a second choice. They didn't call for extraction. They went deeper in. Helmand Province in southern Afghanistan is, by almost any measure, one of the most unforgiving pieces of land on Earth. Roughly the size of West Virginia, it stretches across 58,000 square kilometers of desert, mountain, river valley, and poppy field, baking in summer temperatures that can hit 50 degrees Celsius, freezing in winters that come without warning, and swept year-round by dust storms that can cut visibility to zero in under a minute. The Helmand River runs through it like a spine, green and vital, feeding the irrigation canals that make agriculture possible in what would otherwise be pure desert. And it is along those canals, in the mud-walled compounds that line them, in the shadow of the poppy fields that have made this province responsible for roughly 40% of the world's entire opium supply, that the Taliban have been rooted for decades, not as outsiders, not as invaders, but as a permanent feature of the landscape, as natural and as immovable as the mountains to the north. British forces first deployed to Helmand in serious numbers in 2006, under the optimistic assumption, later described by those involved, as one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures of the entire campaign, that they could establish security in the province with a relatively modest force, without firing a single shot. The commander tasked with the pre-deployment reconnaissance, Brigadier Mark Carlton Smith, reported back to the Ministry of Defense that the province was largely at peace. He warned against deploying a large British force. He said, with uncomfortable accuracy as it turned out, that sending thousands of soldiers into Helmand would create conflict where none currently existed. His warning was not heeded. The 16 Air Assault Brigade went in, and almost immediately, they found themselves in the most intense sustained combat British forces had experienced since the Korean War. The fighting in Helmand was not like the wars that had shaped the previous generation of British military thinking. There were no front lines. There were no uniforms on the other side. There were no clear objectives that, once taken, would signal the end of something. There was only the grinding, relentless, daily reality of an insurgency that seemed to have an unlimited supply of fighters, an unlimited supply of patience, and an apparently inexhaustible ability to absorb punishment and keep coming. British soldiers were dying in ones and twos, week after week, in firefights in the Green Zone along the Helmand River, in roadside bomb strikes on the roads between the district centers, in complex ambushes that suggested a level of tactical sophistication and advanced intelligence that troubled the commanders trying to understand where it was coming from. That was the question nobody could satisfactorily answer. Where was the intelligence coming from? How did the Taliban always seem to know? Not always, but often enough to be alarming. Where British patrols were going, which routes they were using, which compounds they intended to search. There was no shortage of theories. There were Taliban informants in every district. There was the simple reality that in a province where everyone knew everyone, it was almost impossible to move without being noticed. But there was another theory, one that was discussed in hushed tones in the intelligence briefings at Camp Bastion, one that the British government had been formally warned about by its own analysts as early as 2006, that the problem went deeper than local informants. Much deeper. And it was that theory that a four-man SAS patrol was sent to investigate on a cold night in the winter of 2007. The patrol was operating under a special intelligence tasking, the kind that doesn't appear in the normal operations log, the kind that the duty officer at the forward operating base would describe, if pressed, only as a routine reconnaissance task. Special Forces units operating in Helmand during this period were frequently tasked with what the military called pattern-of-life surveillance, spending days or sometimes weeks in concealed positions, watching a specific location, mapping the movement of people and vehicles, identifying who went where and when and with whom. It was painstaking, physically brutal work. The men who did it lay motionless in shallow scrapes in the earth for hours at a time, often in temperatures that swung 20 degrees between day and night, eating cold food and taking turns sleeping in shifts of no more than 90 minutes, always watching, always recording, always listening. This particular tasking had originated not from the standard military intelligence chain, but from a separate source, a signals intelligence thread that had been developing for several weeks, flagged initially by analysts at GCHQ in Cheltenham, and passed through a restricted channel to the Special Forces Support Group coordinating operations in Helmand. The thread concerned communications traffic that had been intercepted passing between a location inside Helmand and a second location across the border in Pakistan's Balochistan province. The content of those communications was, in itself, unremarkable, the kind of logistical chatter that insurgent networks generated constantly. What was remarkable was the timing. The communications were appearing in the intercepts at very specific moments that correlated, with a consistency that went well beyond coincidence, with British operational movements inside the province. Somebody was watching British forces move. Somebody was reporting those movements across the border. And the signals suggested that somebody was doing it from a location that British forces had assessed and continued to assess as essentially neutral. The four-man patrol inserted by helicopter onto a desert landing site 12 kilometers from their objective, then moved on foot through the night. The terrain was rough, dry irrigation ditches, low mud walls, patches of scrub that offered cover but also concealed the kind of pressure plate IEDs that had killed and maimed dozens of British soldiers in the preceding months. They moved slowly, carefully, using the darkness and the uneven ground for cover, guided by GPS and by a hand-drawn map derived from aerial reconnaissance imagery. Their objective was a compound on the southern outskirts of Sangin, a district that had become synonymous, in the minds of the British soldiers who fought there, with the very worst of what Helmand had to offer. By the time they reached their observation position and settled into it, it was past midnight. They had been moving for 4 hours. They were cold, tired, and alert in the way that only people who know they will die if they stop being alert can be. For the first 2 hours, they saw nothing out of the ordinary. Lights in a few compounds, a dog barking somewhere to the east, the distant sound of a vehicle on the road that ran through the center of Sangin. And then, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, something moved at the compound they were watching. A door opened. A figure emerged, walked to a position near the compound wall, and spent several minutes at what appeared, through the thermal imaging sight, to be a piece of equipment. Not a weapon. Something smaller. More deliberate. A communications device of some kind. The figure used it briefly, then went back inside. 14 minutes later, 14 minutes, timed exactly, a response came back. Not from inside Helmand. The signals equipment the patrol was carrying registered the source of the responding transmission as originating from across the Pakistani border. And the figure who had sent the original message was not Taliban. The patrol leader knew his target set. He had studied the imagery for days. The figure at the compound wall was someone else entirely. Someone who, by every official account, was supposed to be on the same side as the British soldiers watching him from the dark. This is the moment the radio went dead. Not because the patrol was compromised. Not because the Taliban had found them. Because the patrol leader, a man with 15 years of special forces experience, a man who had operated in Northern Ireland, Iraq, and 2 previous tours of Afghanistan, looked at what his thermal sight was showing him, looked at the signals data his equipment was recording, and understood, with complete and terrible clarity, that what he was watching was not something he could report up the normal chain of command. Not tonight. Not on an open radio net. Not to a duty officer who would immediately escalate it through channels that very possibly would, reach people with a direct interest in making sure it was never escalated at all. The decision to go silent was not made lightly. Every piece of training, every protocol, every standing operating procedure that British Special Forces operated under told him that losing communications with base was a mission-ending event, that it triggered an immediate search and recovery operation, that it put other units on alert, that it created exactly the kind of noise and activity that a covert surveillance patrol was designed to avoid. He knew all of that. He made the decision anyway. He gathered his team in the shallow scrape they had been lying in for 3 hours, and he told them, in whispers, what he had seen and what he believed it meant. And then he told them what he wanted to do about it. They had a choice. They could call it in, trigger the recovery protocol, and trust that what they had seen would be handled appropriately by the chain of command. Or they could go and get more evidence. Enough evidence that what they had seen could not be buried, could not be explained away, could not disappear into a classified file that would never see daylight. They went deeper in. Moving back through the terrain they had crossed to reach their observation position, they began working their way around the compound from a different angle, approaching from the east this time, using a dry irrigation ditch as cover, moving in single file with 5 meters between each man, the lead scout sweeping the ground ahead with his foot before each step to feel for the wire of a pressure plate. It took them 40 minutes to cover 300 meters. At one point, a vehicle passed on the road less than 80 meters away, headlights sweeping across the open ground, and all 4 men pressed themselves into the ditch and lay completely still while the engine noise faded and disappeared. When they reached the new position, on the eastern side of the compound, they could see something they hadn't been able to see from the original observation point. A vehicle, a type they recognized, a type that had no business being in a Taliban compound on the edge of Sangin in the middle of the night. They recorded everything. Photographs through the thermal imaging optic. Audio recordings of the communications traffic their equipment was capturing. Detailed written notes, made in the dark, on the waterproof paper that Special Forces soldiers carry precisely for moments when they cannot use electronic devices. They lay in that ditch for another 90 minutes, recording, watching, and waiting. At 4:15 in the morning, with the sky beginning to show the first faint suggestion of gray in the east, they began to move. They had what they needed. Now came the harder question, what to do with it. The war in Helmand had a secret that was not, in truth, entirely secret. It was discussed in classified briefings. It was referenced in diplomatic cables. It was known, in general terms, to the senior intelligence officials of every major coalition country involved in the Afghanistan campaign. The secret was this: the insurgency that British forces were fighting and dying to suppress in Helmand was not being sustained entirely from within Afghanistan. It was being supplied, supported, and in certain specific and carefully deniable ways, directed from across the border, from the tribal areas of Pakistan, and from elements within Pakistan's own intelligence establishment, the Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI. This was not a fringe theory. It was the considered assessment of British military intelligence, of the CIA, of NATO's senior commanders, and of Afghanistan's own intelligence service. The head of Afghan intelligence stated it publicly. American generals stated it before Congress. The evidence was not ambiguous. What made it a secret, what kept it from becoming the defining political crisis of the entire war, was the impossibility of acting on it. Pakistan was not an enemy. Pakistan was, officially, a key ally in the war on terror. Pakistani cooperation was essential for the supply routes that kept British and American forces in Afghanistan fed and equipped. Pakistani intelligence shared, selectively, carefully, on its own terms, information about al-Qaeda targets that the coalition needed. Without Pakistan, the war in Afghanistan was strategically untenable, and so the knowledge that elements of the ISI were, simultaneously, providing support and intelligence to the Taliban forces killing British soldiers in Helmand was absorbed into the complex, deeply uncomfortable category of things that were known but could not be officially acknowledged. things that were documented in classified files and discussed in secure briefings, and then, at the level of political decision-making, set aside. What the four-man SAS patrol had recorded in the ditch outside Sangin that night was a piece of that picture. A specific, documented, evidenced piece. The kind that could not easily be explained away, the kind that had names and times and signal intercepts attached to it. When they made it back to their forward operating base at first light, arriving to find the duty officer white-faced and the quick reaction force already half-mounted in their vehicles, the patrol leader did not hand his recordings to the intelligence cell in the normal fashion. He made a phone call instead. A phone call to a number he had been given 18 months earlier at the end of a different briefing by a man who had said to him, "If you ever find something that you don't think should go through the normal chain, use this." He used it. What happened next is the part of this story that remains, to this day, classified. The recordings the patrol made that night were taken out of the normal intelligence system entirely. The signal's data disappeared into a restricted compartment. The after-action report for the patrol described a routine reconnaissance task with no significant intelligence yield. For men who had spent a night in a ditch outside Sangin watching something they were not supposed to see signed their names to a document that said, in effect, that they had seen nothing. And then they went back to their barracks, cleaned their weapons, and said nothing to anyone. Not because they were ordered to, because they understood, with the bone-deep pragmatism that comes from years of operating in the real world rather than the theoretical one, that there are some truths too large and too complicated and too dangerous for the normal mechanisms of accountability to handle. The war went on. The men went back out. And somewhere in a classified file, in a building in London or Cheltenham or Washington, a piece of evidence sat in the dark, waiting for a world that might one day be ready to deal with what it contained. The British combat mission in Helmand officially ended in October 2014. 454 British service personnel were killed in Afghanistan. Thousands more were wounded, physically, psychologically, in ways that don't show up on medical reports and don't qualify for the formal categories of injury that trigger institutional support. The poppy fields of Helmand, which British forces had been sent in part to suppress, were producing more opium at the end of the campaign than they had been at the beginning. The Taliban, which British forces had been sent to defeat, were back in control of most of the province within months of the withdrawal, and back in control of the entire country within 7 years. The questions that the war raised, about what was really happening in Helmand, about who was really funding and supplying and directing the insurgency that killed those 454 men, about what the intelligence services of the coalition countries actually knew and when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. Those questions have never been fully answered. Some of the classified material from the Helmand campaign has been released. Most of it has not. And somewhere in the files that remain sealed, there are almost certainly things that look a great deal like what 4 men recorded from a ditch on the edge of Sangin in the winter of 2007. Things that were known, things that were set aside, things that the machinery of geopolitical necessity decided, very quietly, it was better not to know. The silence, in the end, was not just a choice that 4 soldiers made in the dark. It was a choice that entire governments made, in broad daylight, for years. And the men who died in Helmand paid the price for it.